everybody. Glad to see you again. Well, as much as I can through this little lens, right? But glad to be with you again this week. I want to share something with you that I was inspired by Pastor Ken's devotional last week when he was talking about the importance of water. Of course, that's all in our minds right now, fresh, right, with all the rain that we've been getting all over California. And yet, water was one of those wonderful words that we find in Scripture that has a lot of meaning attached to it. And the pastor talked about that. So I don't want to go over that again. But it made me think of another word that also has so much meaning attached to it. And that is the word bread. So when you think of bread, what do you think of? One of the most pleasant things that we could, for me personally anyway, that I could ever experience is the smell of fresh baked bread. Oh my goodness. Doesn't that just warm your heart thinking about freshly baked bread and wanting to get some of that, maybe spread a bunch of butter on it or something? We've got an amazing thing to be able to experience and enjoy bread. I have to watch it myself because of some dietary concerns, but boy, it just doesn't take away from the fact of how enjoyable that is. Well, bread, and we call that a staple. That's one of our staples, bread, right? And it's what's sustained people, for thousands of years. But of course, it is much more than a staple food, just a physical food. And Jesus was using this analogy in the 6th chapter of the Gospel of John as he was trying to explain to people basically what they really needed, the kind of bread that they really needed and how to get it. And he says, I'm just going to take a few little excerpts out of the 6th chapter of John, a few of his statements to talk about some of this stuff. In the 6th chapter of John and in verse 27, he says, labor not for the meat, you can put bread in there, that perishes, but for that meat which endures unto everlasting life. Now, as important as it is to have food in our stomachs, to continue to live on this earth, what's even more important, the kind of food that we really need, the kind of bread that we really need, is the bread that actually will give us, when we eat it, everlasting life. Now, if you were listening to Jesus in the first century as he was originally saying these words, you might start to wonder, what in the world is he talking about? And so then he begins to expound even more. He's talking about real bread. Well, you mean the bread that we eat isn't real? Well, of course it is. But no, he's obviously talking about bread on a higher spiritual level. In verse 32, he says, I say to you, Moses gave you not that bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the true bread from heaven. The true bread, the real bread. So more clues. What kind of bread do we really need? The kind of bread that brings everlasting life. Well, what is that true bread? What is it? It is a real bread. Well, another clue. He says in verse 35, and here it gets right down to it. He says this in verse 35. I am the bread of life. So now we put two and two together, so to speak, and we find out that this everlasting life bread, this true bread, is none other than Jesus Christ himself. I am the bread of life. They talked to him at this point in time about the miracle that God gave the children of Israel in the wilderness to sustain them throughout their wilderness stay, which was the manna. The manna was the bread that came from God, that appeared in the morning, and all they had to do is just scoop it up, and they had this nourishment that had all the nutrients that they needed to sustain them in the wilderness. And that was a miracle gift from God. And yet, it was just a physical bread. And Jesus talked about at one point in this 6th chapter, yes, they received the manna from God, but they're all dead. So that bread did not and was not what would bring them everlasting life. And so we need more than just physical bread. We need and more than what just sustains us until our next meal. And Jesus says, I am that bread. And in fact, the manna that God gave the children of Israel in the wilderness was actually a foreshadowing picture of who Jesus is. And he says it here point blank, I am the bread of life. In verse 48, that's what he says, I am the bread of life. In verse 51, he says, I am the living bread which came down from heaven. So if any man eat of this bread, he will live forever. The bread that I will give is my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world. So the night before, or the night of the arrest of Jesus Christ, he was in the upper room with his disciples. And he instituted for us what we refer to as the Lord's Supper or the Communion Supper. And he took bread, and he broke the bread, and he told those that were with him at that point in time, this is my body. He took the wine, and he passed it around. This is my blood. Well before that night, Jesus is already basically saying the same thing in the 6th chapter of John. He's saying, listen, the bread that I give is my flesh, and my blood is the wine. Eat my flesh and drink my blood, and you'll never thirst again, and you'll never be hungry again. You will have everlasting life. Now, we have all kinds of needs in our lives. And it seems like it's an ever-expanding thing. As we get, especially in our, Western culture, civilization, it gets more and more complicated. It takes more and more to survive. We talk about the cost of living. What's the cost of living in California? What's the cost of living in Montana or some other state? And we compare what it costs to live in different areas. And it is different in different areas. And if you're like me living in California, you're living in the top 2 or 3 of the highest cost of living areas in the whole country. Everything costs a lot. And we have needs, right? We need a certain amount of money. We need gas in our cars. We need food on the table, right? We need bread. Jesus said, don't spend all your time worrying about and pursuing the bread that you'll only have to have more and more of, that it's just not going to fully satisfy. Spend your time thinking about the bread that gives everlasting life. Well, how can I do that? We have to survive. Yes. But trust God. Jesus said, seek ye first the kingdom of heaven, and everything you need in life, God will give you. Your real needs, the real bread. So as we seek God's kingdom first, what is that? It's all wrapped up in one person. And that person is Jesus Christ. Seek him in your life. Fill yourself up with him. Believe in him for salvation, and you'll never have to worry about that again. And then continue to seek him in your life and fill yourself up with him to find every answer to every question you'll ever have for the rest of the time that you live and breathe on this planet. Bread. Jesus is our bread. God bless you. We'll see you next time.